This is the Art of Darkness podcast with Kevin Kautzman.
And Brad Kelly. We're a couple of very online writers interested in the dark side of what drives creative people to create against all odds.
This show is about art and the people who make it, what it costs them, and what it takes to bring something unique and impactful into the world.
Each episode, we excavate the life and work of an artist you might think you know.
Don't worry, they're all safely dead.
On every episode, we try and find out just what the hell was wrong with them and how they worked through their darkness to create something that lives on after them and continues to move culture.
Find us online at artofdarkpod.com and on Twitter at artofdarkpod. All right, we've got some sponsors for the pod now.
Wait, what?
Every link you need for the things we talk about here is at artofdarkpod.com/sponsors. First up, books.
If you're into this podcast, odds are you're probably a reader. We've got links to buy new books from bookshop.org and used books from alibris.com.
And if you want to listen to your books, we recommend and use audible.com.
It's great, and the catalog is huge.
All right. So if you're listening to this, you are online.
Maybe you're very online.
You probably have a website or are thinking of starting one. Maybe you want a website like artofdarkpod.com. We built that with WordPress, which is by far the most popular way to create websites. And the single best host for serious WordPress is WP Engine. I've personally used them for over a decade now, and I don't host my websites anywhere else. Go to artofdarkpod.com/sponsors and click on the WP Engine link to learn more.
Finally, the best way to support the show is at patreon.com/artofdarkpod. Get the bonus After Dark content for every episode, access to the book club, and more.
Thanks for supporting Art of Darkness. And I don't think that was too painful. I think we did a pretty good job there.
Yeah, that sounded good.
Yeah, we appreciate it.
Okay, and we are back. Art of Darkness, artofdarkpod.com, patreon.com/artofdarkpod, t.me/artofdarkpod for the Telegram channel. Today we're doing an episode on David Foster Wallace. But first, before we get to that, I'm Brad Kelly. This is my co-host, Kevin Kautzman, the great
Howdy.
Kevin Kautzman. How you doing, man?
Yeah, never better. How are you, Brad?
You know, I'm good. But I'm like really conscious that I'm simply supposed to say that I'm good because we have this sort of check-in expectation everyone in our generation has with each other, where it's really, at least in part, to like assuage the guilt of the asker about being somehow there or present or available for the other person. And as the person asked, you have to, especially in the public like this, say that you're, fine or great or as good as can be, or, living the so-called dream, because otherwise the person might have to confront your suffering in a kind of like psychotherapeutic sense, which is to say, too much to ask of someone, especially a putative and or actual friend such as yourself. And so I'm not supposed to say that I've been up since 3 a.m. and I'm going to crash immediately after this episode, or that my stomach kind of hurts a little bit, or that I'm not looking forward to the 7 or 8 things that I have to do tomorrow. And of course, I'm not just a representative of myself here, but a sort of idealized Brad Kelly, co-host of Art of Darkness. And Art of Darkness is like everything else, is sort of brand that has to present itself as somehow something both less than and more than what it actually is. So you might as well ask me how the show is doing, to which I would have to say, for like professional, developmental, and professionalistic showbiz reasons, that it's going really well, which it is. And yet, as modern American, I'm supposed to somehow downplay and be humble while also confident and boisterous. When you get lost in the calculus of finding just the right balance between these two things, you have to ask yourself, how would I even know if it wasn't going just great? Yes, sirree. Okay. So this.
Whoa, doggy.
And I realized that went on for a little too long, and that was half the point. Yes. So today we're going to be talking about David Foster Wallace. If you're not familiar, I was just sort of doing my best David Foster Wallace impersonation. Not a particularly good impersonation. The writing was better than the delivery on that one, I would say. But yeah.
How long did you labor over that intro?
You know what? It's funny. About 3 minutes.
You know what we're going to call that? That was the infinite intro.
There you go. I have another 100 words of it, and I wanted to go just past the point where I was uncomfortable continuing. So anyway, that's it. We're talking about David Foster Wallace, and we got to ask the Art of Darkness question. Kevin, What do you know about David Foster Wallace?
I hadn't even thought about this today.
Hmm.
So let me, well, obviously a novelist, an American novelist of Generation X, I believe,
Hmm.
author of the famous Doorstopper, Infinite Jest, posthumously The Pale King, I
Hmm.
think.
Hmm.
I know that he famously dated some other writers. I can't remember the name, lady writers.
Hmm.
Uh, and that he was a professor. I attempted Infinite Jest before putting it down
Hmm.
in grad school
Many
where we
such cases.
met.
Yep.
And I infer from Infinite Jest that he was a tennis player of some ability
Hmm.
and that he may have been difficult. I think he was also friends with Franzen.
Yes. Yeah.
Yes. And that is and I know that he wrote some essays, and I
Hmm.
believe I've read some of them, but it's been a very long time.
Yeah.
And he shares the name with an airport code.
Yeah, that's right. Dallas, Fort Worth. Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
That's right. Mm-hmm.
So yeah, no, that is all that's all exceedingly accurate, and we'll fill in some spots there that, who are these people that he dated and that sort of thing. But yeah, that's all about fair. And I like that you say I I attempted, I picked up Infinite Jest and put it down. I don't think there's any shame in that. I mean, for people who don't know, Infinite Jest is around 1,100 pages, and it's aspects of reading it are difficult. And I think even David Foster Wallace himself would have said that. We're going to talk more about sort of that book. It's kind of the centerpiece of his oeuvre, so it's sort of necessary. And we're going to talk about, what he was intending with it and a little bit about that book and what people thought about it and, varying opinions. Some people sort of loathe it, but it was very celebrated upon its release. So, especially at a time where big, thick 1,000-page books weren't necessarily on the menu, if you will. Like in the mid 90s, there wasn't a lot
Well,
of that
and
going
it
on.
came out in the mid 90s, huh?
Yeah,
Hmm.
yeah.
Okay. All
Yeah,
right.
interestingly enough, and so we'll kind of launch into it here. So interestingly enough, David Foster Wallace is actually a tail end boomer. So he's born in 1962. Technically, I think Generation X supposedly starts in 1965. But once you get towards the ends of any of these generations, you're kind of a little, it's not a critical
Yeah.
phase anymore, right?
I identify as a Gen X millennial
Yeah,
cusper who was
right.
raised in part by Depression era children of immigrants. It's
Mm-hmm.
all fluid.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, yeah. It's not like you're like, you can't eat at certain restaurants if you're not, Gen X or
I
something.
had we're getting there, Brad. Don't worry. I had a thought earlier this week, and it's like, that meme, and it's the little girl in front of the Twin Towers, and it says the world you grew up in no longer exists.
Mm-hmm.
I had the thought that, like, yeah, but neither did the one it never did. Like, do you know?
Yeah.
What does it
It
all
was always
mean?
imaginary.
It was always imaginary. Yeah, indeed. Yeah. Brad, you cut out here. You're on mute, buddy.
I apologize. We're live
Oh,
streaming. I
good.
was trying to get that thing so it wasn't making noise.
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah.
okay, so we're gonna get into this. I think these generational anxiety sort of thing, not even anxieties, but just noticing them and the different things that affect them and impact them and what they, their place in the world. That stuff is all very front of mind in the David Foster Wallace sort of life and project. So I think this is all relevant stuff. So born February 21st, 1962, dies September 12th, 2008. For people who can't do the quick mental math, 46 years old. Not an old man by any stretch.
Okay, pretty young.
Yeah. He's born in Ithaca, New York. His father at the time is a graduate student in philosophy at Cornell, so no lightweight.
Oh, uh-oh.
Yeah, he was a man who'd done undergraduate work at Amherst, which is going to come back into our story. His dad, James, he comes from a family of I think his dad's still around. His family comes from his family is, sort of professionals from Troy, New York, which is near Albany for people who don't know. Sally, David's mother, comes from a little bit more of a rural family, kind of rural Maine. Her father's a potato farmer, and her grandfather was a Baptist minister. She was actually the first member, David Foster Wallace's mother, the first member of her family to get a bachelor's degree. She got a English degree from Holyoke College, which is one of the Seven Sisters, right near Amherst, which I believe is where his parents met. Would have been right in that area.
And I know you're going to be getting to it, but what are we going to do for After Dark for Patreon subscribers?
Good. Yeah, good. We're going to talk more. We're going to hit it a little bit because we have to for the story here, but we're going to talk about it more in the After Dark. For a variety of reasons that maybe will seem clear. We're going to talk more in depth about the very end of David Foster Wallace's life, the suicide that came in 2008. We're gonna mention it here. It's part of the story. I just mentioned it, but I want to kind of reserve. I felt tabloidy. I'm starting to write down these details, and I'm like, I want to handle this a little differently. So part of how I'm doing that is we're pushing it into the After Dark, and then we're also going to talk about the Pale King, his posthumous novel, which in my opinion, it includes some of the very best David Foster Wallace writing. So I'm going to share a couple bits of that with you that I think rank as good or better than anything he ever did.
Are you do we call this a do-rag? Are you gonna put that back on for the
for
Patreon?
I might.
Yeah, just for me. Yeah. Patreon.com/Art of Dark Pod. I'll say it again. Patreon.com/Art of Dark Pod. Please support the pod. Every episode we do for the remainder of the year will feature an American literary figure who kills himself. I am kidding.
Please don't. I can't handle that psychically, Kevin.
We have a far more diverse array of people who we are doing this year. It's going to be fun. We just happened to pick. I did Hemingway and Brad did the FW. It's a coincidence.
Yeah. And it's interesting. We're going to see, I think, as different as these guys were in terms of the work that they put out, I think and obviously they weren't born at the same time, generational differences. I think we're actually going to see a surprising number of similarities between the two. So it's just interesting. We sort of coincidentally put these two guys next to each other. Sometimes we plan a little bit the sequence of our core episodes, but really it's not so much like we're trying to do two similar people. There's no planning. It's simply just chaos. And we do take requests, not that we always meet them, but we have an ongoing spreadsheet from people. And of course you can get at us in the Telegram, t.me/artofdarkpod. We also have an email, artofdarkpod@gmail.com. I genuinely like hearing from people. You should do this person, you should do that person. And they all go into the spreadsheet. And so we're in season 3 right now. Season 3 is already in the queue, but we'll start thinking about season 4 sooner rather than later because we like to plan ahead. We will be doing a couple of episodes that are gonna have to be a 1-2 punch on purpose. Like I think I do Freud, you do Jung. That's gonna be fun. And then I really like this idea of doing Shakespeare Stratfordian. Kevin. And Shakespeare Oxfordian, Brad. I love that idea. And I think we should do it legit. Like the same day. So the other person does it. So we both do like 2.5 hours. Anyway, this is turning into a production meeting. Right.
But you got to get excited about what Art of Darkness is doing. And if you want us to keep doing this and you want us to keep spending the hours researching and buying books and digging in so we can deliver these core episodes, support us at patreon.com/artofdarkpod. All right, back to DFW.
Yeah. So, one thing I want to mention as I'm getting into just kind of what my references are going to be. Primarily, we're going to be looking at Every Love Story is a Ghost Story. This is sort of the biography by D.T. Max. Also, an interesting book. Kind of never really read a book quite like this. Although, of course, you end up becoming yourself, A Road Trip with David Foster Wallace. This was the one that was turned into the movie End of the Tour with with Jason Segel playing David Foster Wallace. People may be familiar with that. That's based on this book and the interviews from this book. And then his I've got a couple other articles and things we'll talk about when they come up, and then of course the work of David Foster Wallace himself. So
Cool.
So we were talking about his parents. Let me read a little bit about his mother. Just to give you a sense of, I want to give you a sense of the household he grew up in, and I think aspects of his personality are probably going to make sense once we sort of have an idea of where he came from. So this is about his mother. Then this is from the Every Love Story is a Ghost Story. Quote, "No one else listened to David as his mother did. She was smart and funny, easy to confide in, and included him in her love of words. Even in later years, and in the midst of his struggle with the legacy of his childhood, he would always speak with affection of the passion for words and grammar she had given him. If there was no word for a thing, Sally Wallace might invent it. Greebles, for instance, meant little bits of lint, especially those that feet brought into bed. Twanger was the word for something whose name you didn't know or couldn't remember. She loved the word fantods, meaning a deep feeling of fear or repulsion, and talked of the howling fantods, this fear being intensified. These words, like much of his childhood, would wind up in Wallace's work. To outside eyes, Sally's enthusiasm for correct usage might seem extreme. When someone made a grammatical mistake at the Wallace dinner table, she would cough into her napkin repeatedly until the speaker saw the error. She protested to supermarkets whenever she saw the sign 10 items or less posted above their express checkout lanes. Wallace would later give this campaign in Infinite Jest to the predatory mother figure of Averil and Cadenza, co-founder of the Militant Grammarians of Massachusetts. For Sally, David's mother, grammar was more than just a tool. It gave membership in the club of educated persons. The intimation that so much was at stake in each utterance thrilled David and added to the excitement of having a gifted mother, as did her sensitivity. Sally hated to shout. If she was upset by something, she would write a note, and if David or Amy had a response, they would slip it back under her door in turn. Even as a little boy, Wallace was attuned to the delicate drama of personality. Okay.
Oh, I had a mother who was a grammar Nazi.
Is that right?
For sure. School teacher.
Yeah.
And I grew up around people for whom that made you stand out.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It was not always an easy road to hoe. Idiocracy, where he talks and everybody thinks he sounds absolutely ridiculous.
Right.
It's a little bit like that at times.
Right.
Yeah.
But for the sort of flip side of it is like, if you think about her background and if you come from a less educated situation and you're looking to have that American dream upward mobility, well, one thing that's free is enunciating and using proper grammar. That's free.
Right. Just ripping the word ain't out of your vocabulary you're right. It's free, but it can cost little boys an awful lot on the playground.
It's not cool. Nobody thinks it's cool.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Very
sure.
Interesting. I like that she would cough until they corrected themselves.
Yeah. So if they said she'd just do that kind of thing until they got it right. And DFW would be a bit of a grammar. He would vary because we'll get to it. I mean, he was interested in inexact and in quote unquote incorrect language, but he also was like he was one of these people who he believed that you had to know the grammar deeply if you were going to screw around with it as a writer, right? Like you don't just get to write whatever you want. You have to know exactly why you're making the choices you're making if you're going to mess with grammar, which I tend to agree with. So that was his mother. His father, I don't have as much to say about him necessarily, but he seems to be just generally a very kind man. Like I said, philosopher, that would be his career, would be in philosophy and in academia. He wrote books on ethics and pragmatism and John Dewey, and would sometimes read from books at the dinner table, even supposedly Moby Dick when they were just children. So
John Dewey.
John Dewey. It's not the Dewey Decimal System guy. John Dewey, I can't remember exactly what it is, but it's very like pragmatic sort of, American philosophy. Yeah.
Whenever I hear the name Dewey, aside from the decimal system, I think
Mm.
of the law firm Dewey, Cheatham, and Howe.
Right. That's right.
Little kind of
Yeah.
dad joke.
I don't think this is that Dewey, but
Mm.
yeah, but very, it's, and this is, I guess, is important. It's very, um, his father, James Wallace, he's not into any sort of radical philosophy. He's not really into like even continental. He's almost like, it's very like it's pragmatism. It's like, how do you decide the sort of very basic, like everyday right thing to do kind of philosophy, right? Nothing wrong with that. But that is going to be important for us thinking about David's evolution.
And did you say that his father came from an established professional family?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, we don't want anything too extreme.
Mm-hmm.
Things are working out for the is it Wallace family?
The Wallace family. Yeah. There's a bit of a like, you could study philosophy as long as you don't find anything in there that makes you quit your good job. It's that kind of thing, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
If the philosophy starts to make you feel something,
shut it down.
Right out. Shut it down.
Yeah. All right. I've got a bit again from the biography about what it was like growing up in the Wallace household. Quote, the Wallace home was one where there was always room for an appeal. From the age of 10, David would write memos to his parents detailing injustices, so it was natural for him to assume that the rest of the world would be as interested in his opinion. This approach led predictably to friction with many grown-ups. David's cries of "why" and "that doesn't make sense" were familiar at Yankee Ridge Elementary, where he went from 1969 to 1974. And though teachers saw how smart he was, many found him a handful. One day at Crystal Lake Day Camp, where he and Amy went many summers, he grew tired of the counselors and the rules and simply walked several miles back to his house. His mother drove back to the camp in a fury and asked them to produce her son. When they could not, she said, "Because he's at home." Yeah. Anyway,
he went to Camp Crystal Lake.
Yeah, I thought that was an odd.
Oh, geez. He is Jason.
He just missed out on Jason Voorhees.
Jason Voorhees with a do-rag correcting his grammar. He doesn't like it at all.
He's like, if I stabbed you, it would feel good for me, but then I'd be worried about the fact that I was...
Very curious, yes. And then the whole thing with the mother as well.
Yeah, and
and what was it? What was it called? Yankee Ridge
Elementary School. Yeah, this is actually once they moved to Illinois, because he didn't really grow up in Ithaca. They moved. They moved.
I see. So they're in Illinois now. Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Got it.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think he was 4 years old or something when they moved to Illinois. He had a sister, was born 2 years after him. And when they moved to Illinois, this is basically his father had earned his PhD and had gotten a position teaching philosophy at the University of Illinois. And his father would stay there, University of Illinois, teaching philosophy for almost 50 years. Right. So
the Fighting Illini.
Right. Yep. And they buy this house that was sort of situated right up against farmland. So there isn't, they're not farmers, but they're very much like they're in a more rural environment than even the suburbs, I would say. Okay. So let's see his mother went on to teach English at Parkland Community College. So they're both, in the community college, and his father's teaching philosophy at University of Illinois. And this is the environment that they're in. There's a latent, but sort of never clearly articulated pressure that David Foster Wallace feels to succeed academically, right? He's always kind of feeling that, like, well, my dad's a tenured professor of philosophy. I've got to do at least that much, whatever it is that I end up doing, right?
Yeah. Many such cases.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm going to try to paint this picture of like this kid. So they're living out almost in the country. There is some civilization there. David Foster Wallace gets, I don't think this is going to be a surprise, he sort of reads obsessively, reads at a higher level. One of these kids, obviously he reads sort of past the level of his school, and you'd expect that just from who his parents are, kind of, right? That's like, this is going to be sort of an expectation. They were probably reading to him very early. Like I said, maybe Moby Dick at the dinner table when they were children. But he also gets obsessed with television. Intense amounts of TV, watching everything. Night Gallery, Rod Serling show after Twilight Zone, Kojak the Night Stalker, Price is Right. He got into soap operas. Like, he would watch everything, right? And later on, when he has sort of acknowledges his addictions, he will kind of come around to the opinion that television was actually his worst addiction out of all of them. And,
Heavy.
This is a guy who, went into rehab for alcohol. So, but television actually, he thought, was something he had more of a problem with.
That's a thing people don't talk about. Everybody talks now about the little black rectangle, which is reasonable.
It is.
And yet I guarantee there are a lot of people out there still right now who have an addiction to television.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, for sure.
You figure 3-4 hours a day, you should like recoil in horror at the thought of that. But that's a normal day for a lot of people.
I mean, when I was a kid, the television was always on in our house.
Always on.
At least one television, sometimes 2 or 3, but always at least one television was on. So this resonated with me. I was like, yeah, I get that. You're home, you just watch TV, watch whatever's on. Yeah, doesn't matter.
Yeah, and this is what I meant earlier about that. The world of your childhood didn't exist either. It's all fugazi. It's all media and
right
vapor and
like I said, he had a sister. David was not always super kind to her. She would say nice things about him afterwards, that he was something like a benevolent bully. He was apparently, fairly aggressive with her at times and always was bigger than her. He apparently one time, I don't know the details. I don't know that anybody knows the details. He apparently once knocked out little Amy, his sister's front teeth, in some kind of tug of war accident. And then even like when they were in their teens, he would sometimes tease her, and he would sort of cross the line into kind of calling her fat and ugly, which she was neither of these things by any means. So a little bit of like aggression, a little bit of sort of pushing down, a little bit, but sibling stuff too.
Where is that coming from? Do you have any idea? Just boys will be boys. Like,
I think there's a little bit of that. I think there's
children are cruel. I mean, they don't know.
There's a little bit of sibling stuff that just is often takes on a physical nature. I think he was super competitive. And I think he was super self-aware of that, and like didn't like that part of himself, but it was clearly there. So it could have been.
I'm already beginning to understand why he would make a do-rag part of his personality later in life. Right. Just feels right.
Yeah, we're going to talk about it, but it is a funny gesture. It's sort of like one of these things. There's always this like, he's sort of performing, but sort of hating that he's performing, but has to do it, and then like does things to seem like he's hiding from performing that seem even more like it never stops sort of folding in on itself, the persona that he's presenting.
Well, and maybe I'm getting a little ahead of things here, but I can see why in a funny way you'd think he would have been more reclusive. Like you think about Salinger, who's gotten away with it, or got away with it. Is Salinger alive?
I think he died a couple of years ago.
Yeah, he died, right? And then Pynchon, who's gotten away with it. I mean, it seems like DFW might have been one of these guys who could have benefited from that kind of anonymity. But in any case.
I think the challenge here is there was, and we're going to talk more about it, the level of attention on Infinite Jest when it first dropped was about as big as it can be for a piece of literary fiction. Like, I don't know that anything since then in American letters has gotten this kind of attention on its release. In terms of like a literary, like a quote unquote smart person's book, right? Like Stephen King like dropped Cormac. Maybe a Cormac McCarthy. Cormac McCarthy is probably the biggest one since. And then we will talk about it, but David really wanted people to see him. Like he really wanted like that pat on the head from the universe that was like, you're special, David.
Well, and maybe there's something about the TV and this TV fixation he wants to see. And there's that voyeuristic thing. Hi, YouTube.
Right.
YouTube.com/@artofdarkpod. And, but at the same time, like, it's a desire to be seen. You want to be reflected back in it. Did you ever get on television at any point, Brad? Like as a child,
No.
Did they ever interview? They interviewed me once for something at my school, and I was on the local news for like 5 seconds. This was an event.
Right.
This felt like, then there's just something about that. Yeah,
for sure.
Weird. Yeah, I don't exist until the box says that I exist.
Right.
Somehow.
Right. And
Very
so when
strange.
Infinite Jest comes, it's like he does literally exist now. And so how do you say no to all that? Like, I think there would be, in thinking again about that folding in on himself, if he says no, like that's performative. Like, you know what I mean? It's like you're saying no, because you're too good for it. It's like, this is all you know. So it sort of makes sense to me why he was a bit of a public figure. I want to read something again. We're still in his childhood. And I think this is an important piece from the biography. Quote, there is another thread that weaves in and out of Wallace's childhood. He believed in later years that the mental disease that would in many ways define his life began at this time, summer of 71 or 72. He's 9 years old. Wallace was first occasion of depressive, clinically anxious feelings. He became excessively afraid of mosquitoes, especially of their buzzing. His parents say they did not notice problems this early, nor did his sister. It's a lot easier to fix something if you can see it, a character comments in Infinite Jest. But in a family that prided itself on openness, Wallace never felt safe disclosing himself. He worried then, as he always would later, that to know him too well would be to dislike him, or at least dislike him as much as he disliked himself. He felt a victim, as he would later write, of, quote, imposter syndrome. Now, some people say if you have imposter syndrome, you are an imposter. I don't know if that's actually true or not, but so he's dealing with the beginnings of what he would call later the bad thing in his life. And this basically never goes away. The bad thing, the depression, it takes vacations, it leaves him alone briefly, but it's never gone ever. So this is going to keep coming back up. As he becomes a
That's
teenager,
interesting. So we've got with DFW, we have the bad thing. With Hemingway, he called it his black ass.
Yeah.
PKD called it the black iron prison.
Mm-hmm.
Although, of course, maybe that's not the exact parallel. But what a very curious phrase. The bad thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Like it's a being of its own. Like it's a monster.
Yeah, and that you have to sort of contend with, and you appease it and hide
Burroughs.
it. Burroughs, first episode. Yeah, the ugly spirit. Yeah,
the ugly spirit. Oof.
Yeah. So this is in some ways.
I'm gonna give mine a nickname. I'm gonna call mine like Gary or something. Gary's been over again.
Yeah, he's been
Don't worry, the gun's unloaded. Gary's not gonna get me now.
Yeah. As DFW gets into his teenage years, he discovers two important things, I would say, in his work or in his life. The first is marijuana, and the second is tennis. I'm going to read you a little bit about tennis as a boy or a teenager from this article he wrote that would be in Harper's and later collected in his work of nonfiction called Tennis Trigonometry Tornadoes. Okay. And this is good because this gives us, we haven't gotten any of David Foster Wallace's real words yet. So I think this is a good taste, and it's biographical. Between the ages of 12 and 15, I was a near great junior tennis player. I cut my competitive teeth beating up on lawyers and dentist kids at Little Champagne and Urbana country club events, and was soon killing whole summers being driven through dawns to tournaments all over Illinois, Indiana, and Iowa. At 14, I was ranked 17th in the United States Tennis Association's Western section, 4th in the state of Illinois, and around 100th in the nation, having flown in 1976 at the regional association's expense to the U.S. National Junior Hardcourt Championships in Kalamazoo, Michigan. where in the second round, I got my rural ass handed to me by a California kid named Scott Davis, who's now a marginal figure on the pro circuit. My flirtation with tennis excellence had way more to do with a weird proclivity for intuitive math and with the township where I learned and trained than with athletic talent. Even by the standards of junior competition, in which everybody's a tight bud of pure potential, I was a pretty untalented tennis player. My hand-eye was okay, but I was neither large nor quick, had a near concave chest and wrists so thin I could bracelet them with a thumb and a pinky, and could hit a tennis ball no harder or truer than most girls my age. What I could do, in the words of my township's juniors coach, a thin guy who chewed Red Man and spat into a Folgers can, was, quote, play the whole court. This was a tennis cliche that could mean any number of things. In my case, it meant I knew my limitations and the limitations of the courts I played on and adjusted thusly. I was at my best in bad conditions. Now, conditions in central Illinois are, from a mathematical perspective, interesting, and from a tennis point of view, bad. Summer heat and wet mitten humidity, moths and crap gnats forming an asteroid belt around each tall lamp at night, and the whole lit court surface aflutter with spastic little shadows, mosquitoes that spawn in the field's furrows and in the conferva, I don't know what that means, conferva-chocked ditches that box each field, and most of all, wind. Okay, so very good tennis player for a kid, right? But sort of not raw talented, right? Go ahead.
Did he, in Infinite Jest, do I recall him talking about, I might be conflating Infinite Jest with the Agassi auto bio, but one
Wallace
of them
would find that
about,
interesting that you did that, if that's the case.
Okay, well, there it is.
Yeah, go ahead.
There you have it. But one of them talks about tennis being a battle for territory. It's a war for territory.
That could have been in Infinite Jest. Infinite Jest is 1,100 pages. There's a lot in there. It could very well be in there.
It might be in there. I can't say I'm going to rush to reread it or attempt to reread it. But that is an interesting point to make, and I am noticing his astounding ability to sort of describe the game on a really serious and heavy level, and he clearly thought about it. Not just to hit the ball, and of course they all do, but few, he may be exclusive in the ability to describe it with that kind of level of, prose styling, you would say. But it's really tempting to think about tennis as hit the ball over. You're trying to get a win with the ball, but really they're battling for the court the entire time. You're not just trying to hit it back. You're trying to hit it back in a way that the other person is going to struggle to hit it back to you. And if they do hit it back to you, it's going to be hit back to you in some way that's advantageous to you, right? I mean, that's so funny because that's our philosophy for the podcast. That's right. Yeah, top this one, Kevin. Good luck.
So tennis, big deal. He would later in his teenage years, he would work summers teaching tennis at like the local park. He would teach like the kids class in the morning. He would teach some, middle-aged women in the afternoon. This was sort of his job. I think his first job was teaching tennis, actually. And I did want to stress this because it was important to him. It's important to Infinite Jest, but like also that he was quite good. Again, 100th in the nation. No one's putting you on the cover of a magazine, but that's it's better than I did in any sports. It's better than maybe anybody I personally knew growing up with did in any sports, honestly. So, pretty good, pretty talented guy, right? In his way, as he described it. He also does pretty well in school. An English teacher of his in high school said that he was the brightest student she remembers ever teaching. And between that, good grades, and you've got this travel tennis thing, you can imagine he kind of quickly develops a certain level of autonomy that maybe another boy his age wouldn't have had, right? Hey, David's a good kid, great tennis player. He's good sports, doing good in school. He doesn't really get in trouble. Go let him do his thing. And so a certain amount of, and this helps this aided his sort of addictions or issue with weed and with television, right? And just sort of given maybe a little bit too much room, maybe.
Yeah, what's the big complaint about weed? It's going to make you lazy. It's going to make you maybe a bit stupid. It might make you creative, God forbid.
Right.
But no, here he is. He's an excellent athlete.
Yeah. So even if you find out he's smoking pot, it's like, well, I don't know.
Can't really accuse him of being lazy. He's doing well in school.
Right. At
any point, Brad, may I interject? At any point,
ahead.
did you come across this list of his favorite books? Is that something
I did. I don't have it handy, but
I've got it. I
okay.
will, because in the chat, because we are streaming this on YouTube live, in the chat, it just happened to come up. One of our, and I think this is interesting. One of the fellows in the chat said that he heard from an exorcist that just as everyone has a guardian angel assigned to them, the devil assigned an evil spirit to every person just for them, which is great. Very interesting and exciting. I don't know how doctrinal that is,
right.
but I wrote back saying the Screw Tape podcast, because of course the Screw Tape letters, and then it just so happens another person
cool.
in the chat said that was apparently on a list that he may have just been having a laugh, but apparently that's the number one book.
No, that was an important book to him. Yeah, the Screw Tape letters are an important book to him for sure. Yeah.
Funny synchronicity. We'll go down this whole list of the top 10 on the After Dark for Patreon, patreon.com/artofdarkpod. And these will be DFW's favorite books, according to him. And there may have been a little bit of
maybe a little flimfamery. I think it's probably sincere. I think you might be surprised. I think people might be surprised by how commercial some of it is.
Very commercial.
Yeah.
Yeah. We'll get into it on the After Dark.
Yeah. I like that. Okay, here's a little description, kind of what's going on with Wallace teenage years. Again from the bio, quote, Wallace was growing less and less happy. His childhood anxiety was back. He could be obsessive, unwilling, or unable to leave whatever impinged on his world unexplored. Mostly it seemed funny more than anything else to those who knew him, character rather than disease. He wrote in a later essay, my particular neurological makeup is extremely sensitive, car sick, air sick, height sick. My sister likes to say I'm life sick. Okay, but by the end of high school, his problems were hard to ignore. On his sister's 15th birthday, Wallace refused to go out with his family. Why would I want to celebrate that? He asked pointedly. The family was confused and chalked it up to his always simmering competitiveness with Amy. But in fact, as they realized years later, he was having an anxiety attack. Right. So he's, on the edge of anxiety, depression, sort of acting out, lashing out. These things are all sort of boiling and taking shape when he's a teenager. Now he's got some other things that aren't just there's not just sort of the depressive thing. There is a pretty profound social anxiety. And to talk a little bit about this,
at this point, the family is just thinking it's a phase.
Yes.
He's going through a phase.
Yeah. And I think he was hiding it too, as much as he could, as much as you can, hide a thing like that, which you can't hide it entirely, but you can shave the edges off of it. Right. So it's not as pronounced. He had a thing where he sweat a lot, and it's not really worth noting, except he writes about it in The Pale King. He makes another character have this sweating issue, and he exaggerates it like intensely. I'm going to read a little bit of this because it's sort of about himself, but it's made much worse to comical effect. So again, this is from The Pale King. Quote, it was in public high school that this boy learned the terrible power of attention and what you pay attention to. He learned it in a way whose very ridiculousness was part of what made it so terrible, and terrible it was. At age 16 and a half, he started to have attacks of shattering public sweats. Reading down a little bit. In his 17th year, though, it started to bother him. He became self-conscious about the sweating thing. This was surely related to puberty, the stage where you suddenly get much more concerned about how you appear to other people, about whether there might be something visibly creepy or gross about you. Within weeks of the start of the school year, he became more and more differently aware that he seemed to sweat more than the other kids did. The first couple of months of school were always hot, and many of the old high school's classrooms didn't even have fans. Without trying to or wanting to, he started to imagine what his sweating might look like in class. His face gleaming with a mixture of sebum and sweat, his shirt sodden at the collar and pits, his hair separated into wet little creepy spikes from his head's running sweat. It was the worst if he was in a position where he thought girls could maybe see it. The classroom's desks were all crammed together. Just the presence of a pretty or popular girl in his sightline would make his internal temperature rise. He could feel it happening unwilled, even against his will, and start the heavy sweating. Okay, reading down a little bit more. For there were by this time degrees and gradations of public sweating. from a light varnish all the way up to a shattering, uncontrollable, and totally visible and creepy sweat. The worst thing was that one degree could lead to the next if he worried about it too much. If he was too afraid that a slight sweat would get worse and tried too hard to control or avoid it, the fear of it could bring it on. He did not truly begin to suffer until he first understood this fact, and understanding he came to slowly at first, and then all of an awful sudden. Okay, and it goes on for a while, but you can imagine the fact that he was writing about this 30 some years later towards the end of his life. This was and he's kind of having a laugh with it, but I think he saw this deep metaphor, this notion that if you think about the thing you're self-conscious of, you actually make it worse, and then you're more self-conscious about it. That's, I think, a very apt analogy for his entire sort of psychology. And this is that behavior that I was doing at the beginning, my quote unquote impersonation of David Foster Wallace. It's you never stop folding in on what the thing is, right? Ever. And you can imagine that gets painful and uncomfortable. It gets uncomfortable to be that after a while.
If that was your internal monologue, I don't know what you would do. Well, you'd probably end up
writing 1,000. You'd probably end up writing some monstrous book like this bad boy, right?
Right. Or you might look for the nearest exit.
Yeah. Agreed. Mm-hmm. So nonetheless, he does really good in high school, and he is off to Amherst, where his father went. I don't know, Kevin. Do you know anything about Amherst?
Not really.
Okay.
I mean, it's in Massachusetts, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I believe it's what they would call what's the line from Nutcracker? A highly prestigious, a highly esteemed liberal arts college.
Yes.
Something like that. I believe that's what it is. Nutcracker in the book club coming up for Patreon. The great Dan Baltic, the show's lawyer, until if and when they ever flip us on the charts in Cyprus, and then we've got serious problems. But in any case, we have a book club too. Check it out. It's at the website, artofdarkpod.com. Fun. Absolutely. Well, so Amherst, I mean, it's one of these schools that, like a flyover rube like me, you hear about, it's supposed to be important. Mm-hmm. It's not an Ivy League school, but it's out east. It's a big deal, probably extremely expensive, fancy pants, fancy lad school. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it is. I mean, depending on what you think college should be for, it's a very, very good school.
You're right. And what does he go? What does he study?
He sort of uncertain at first, but eventually he's thinking about going into philosophy, specifically logic. He very much liked, remember the kind of philosophy his father liked? He likes it to be as mathematical as it can be. Like he wants. And
of course, I have a degree in philosophy from the great University of Minnesota, which regularly beats Amherst. I'm making this up. I have no idea. But I was so thrilled to finally be past my math requirements by the time I got into like my second year of university, and only to discover that you have to take formal logic in order to get a philosophy degree at the University of Minnesota, and they snuck a math class in. It's just a math class. And interestingly,
engineering, bachelor's of engineering.
Interestingly enough, it's one of the classes that I got the most out of because I struggled so mightily with it.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, that's
very difficult. It was difficult for me. That's in any case.
So that's the direction he wanted to go. Things would change by the time he gets out of it. We're going to talk about it a little bit because this is the critical period. A little bit on Amherst, third oldest college in Massachusetts, which we know is, that means it's probably up there with the oldest colleges in the country. It's fairly small. It's one of these schools that gets about 1,000 to maybe 2,000 students a year, right?
I just think it's hilarious. It's so tiny.
It's little. It's very little. And you start out in a sort of an open curriculum. I mean, you kind of determine what your own, to a certain degree, what your own, your education is going to be made up of. It's got some pretty alumni worth mentioning, including 6 Nobel laureates. Calvin Coolidge went to Amherst. the one-time prime minister of Greece, and the Prince of Monaco, actually, who was there at the same time as David Foster Wallace, and they were in Glee Club together. Just an odd, it's an odd kind of thing. Interestingly, more than one directors of the CIA went to Amherst. I don't know why that is, but
great school, outstanding school.
Yeah.
Just a brilliant school. Anyone who went to Amherst is brilliant.
Right.
Clearly.
Yeah. I think that's true.
A fantastic school.
Mm-hmm.
What's their mascot?
I have no idea. Oh my God. Oh, I'm on a list now.
I'm gonna look it up right now.
Yeah. Go Ammies or whatever.
It's a mammoth.
Really?
This is there's a new mascot. A mammoth.
Go Mams.
The old mascot was called the Lord Jeffs, and they dropped it for some reason.
Yeah, well, I don't know what a Lord Jeff is. Like, is a Lord? I don't really know.
We agree not to look into this further.
Yeah.
I just want to crawl back into the comfort of my state school, my big university. You just hide.
Yeah, you don't even want to. Yeah,
they're like
just
50,000 students at a time. You're just literally. I am just a number.
You can hear the sound of a meat grinder their first day on campus for some reason.
They're getting educated by the state.
Yeah. 1,000 people. That's how many people were like at the Chipotle when I tried to go to lunch at colleges I went to. Yeah,
100%.
So anyway, Wallace does pretty well as a student. He's in some ways he's well equipped for academia. He makes some friends, and they quickly start to realize, just how smart David Foster Wallace really is, right? He's getting A+ in everything. He's getting notes from teachers that say things like, quote, "This is the finest piece of writing I've ever read." One time he comes into his freshman dorm room at 1 a.m. stoned out of his mind, tells his roommate that David Wallace says, "Hey man, I read that I can write a better paper on Henry V than you." Scans his roommate's essay, disappears for a couple of hours, comes back, gives the kid a report, and that report gets an A, right? Very weird, like kind of prodigious stuff. He wins an award for the highest grade point average for a freshman, and he does all of this stoned out of his mind. Okay. He makes a number of friends though during this time that would be friends for life, including this guy Mark Costello, who he would later write a book with called Signifying Rappers, sort of a pop academic kind of cultural commentary on rap music. I
had to do this. I looked up the controversy around the Lord Jeffs.
Okay.
And it's chef kiss perfect. It's exactly what you would think. It's perfect. The mascot is a caricature of Lord Geoffrey Amherst, an English general who proposed giving blankets from smallpox patients to Native Americans. Quoting, "Could it not be contrived to send the smallpox among those disaffected tribes of Indians?" Lord Amherst wrote in one letter. The college says, America. It's a good school. And now it educates the heads of the CIA.
Yeah. Right.
Great. Cool.
Yeah. I think I no further comment, I think.
Enough said about Amherst.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Let's see, what else about his time at Amherst? Oh, he makes friends with this kid, Corey Washington, and I'm really only mentioning him not because he's super important biographically. He seems like an interesting guy in his own right, but not that he's super important to David Foster Wallace, except that he was going to Amherst at 15 years old. This was one of David's closest friends at the time. Just that's interesting. He was starting to get Wallace was some interest from girls, as Kevin, you probably know, in college kicks off and all kinds of things become attractive to different people for different reasons. I think we can say, as a college kid, he's very like unlaced Timberland boots, sort of like Chicago Bears sweatshirt, very not particularly concerned with his appearance on the one hand, but also on the other hand, like desperately insecure about his acne and his sweating and that sort of thing, right? So it's sort of like maybe you could compensate for the stuff you're worried about if you just like cared a little bit about some of the easy stuff. You know what I mean? Like,
I think this is why I identify him with Gen X a little bit, because he feels that way, just his appearance and the vibe he puts off.
Oh yeah, he's definitely. I identify him with the Generation X as well. Actually, it made me like look up. Wait, what are the Generation X years? Like this has to be, but technically,
well, that's perfect. That's exactly what that is. It's just neither here nor there. Yeah.
Second semester of sophomore year rolls around, and the bad thing comes back on him. He, it turns out that David Foster Wallace's aunt on his mother's side and a great uncle had both taken their own lives. Other members of the family had suffered from depression to varying degrees. And he's starting to be able to articulate what's going on to him a little more to friends and family. I want to stress a little more. He would tell his sister around this time that basically what it boiled down to is that the world was frightening and uncomfortable and nothing seemed to have any meaning. So
it's so tricky because an assessment of the world like that is not necessarily wrong.
Right.
And if you don't have something like a strong faith or something you're passionate about, which palliates that, or, this is where the addictions start to come in and you're trying to just fill that hole and more TV and probably, has he started drinking yet? No.
Not really. No, not in any kind of noticeable problem way. I'm sure he has drank at this point to some degree, but mostly
but he's already got the marijuana. So, okay.
Yeah. But the pot, really, I'm not going to say that people don't have problems with it sometimes. For him at this time, it probably was exacerbating the depression, maybe, but it didn't seem to interfere with his ability sort of on a moment to function. Like, so,
clearly not.
It's hard to see what role that played in all this, but none of this stuff is, there's no one thing to explain a situation like this. Right. So he goes back to Illinois. He like takes a leave of absence. He goes back to Illinois. He drives a school bus for a while.
And the Glee Club was never the same.
That's right. I'm sure he was a great singer.
He drives a school bus?
Yeah, like as a job, like as something to do with his time, He's
sounds horrible.
He's moving back with his parents. And it's funny, like to me, is like I saw this picture of him moving back to this sort of semi-rural Illinois, just flat, right? Nothing really going on. He apparently liked how flat it was. He found that comforting. And he found the geometry of the farmland itself, the way things are sort of like noticeably demarcated. He found that comforting as well. So just a sort of, some people do find that comforting. I think a lot of people find the rural environment comforting, but I don't think many people are like, I like it because it's all very clear, very carefully laid out. Like, I don't think that's what people like about those environments usually.
Well, it probably reminds them of a tennis court
or something. Yeah. Right.
Yeah. And the shape of a book.
Yeah. Yeah. It feels like being at home. During this time, this break, sophomore year of Amherst, this is when he actually starts writing. He'd written very little up until this time. One of his first stories is called The Clangbirds. I'm not going to read it or anything, but it is interesting because he, throughout his life, will occasionally refer to clangbirds. And in this book, it's about a fictional bird or species of bird that flies in ever-decreasing circles until it disappears up its own ass.
This is like my career.
Yeah, exactly. Same.
What do you mean? Wait, so it goes in ever narrowing circles and then it literally flies up its own ass?
Yeah, it's like a thought experiment, right? It's like, what if a bird just kept flying in smaller and smaller circles? Would it fly up its own ass kind of thing? Right. Yeah.
Huh. So I suppose it would.
Yeah. Right.
Okay.
So this is the kind
of a short thought experiment.
Yeah, it's not that interesting.
Okay.
It's about as interesting as one sentence. he would experiment with some more realistic stuff at this time too. He's whatever, 19 years old. He's just sort of playing around with it at this point. He writes some sentimental poetry. I mean, who hasn't? And he starts to strongly consider a career in politics. And what's interesting, and this will bubble up a little bit from time to time, I think it's probably very easy to just offhandedly assume that David Foster Wallace is a sort of, I don't know, like off the shelf liberal. I would think is probably what most people would think. And most of his public statements, things he said in public that had a political cast to them, were in the George W. Bush invade Iraq era. So, you could be extremely conservative and still be pretty pissed off at George W. Bush, right? What we find is that his temperament is actually fairly conservative. He had a real thing that was like almost sexual for Margaret Thatcher when he was young. He had like a poster of her in his room, which that's just weird to me.
The Iron
Yeah. He had a thing for her. Yeah. I don't know I don't have a good explanation.
I think that qualifies as like a BDSM adjacent kink. The Thatcher poster.
Right.
Fascinating.
It seems like it. That seems kind of odd.
Rather severe.
Yeah. And I think in other ways he was fairly like a fairly conservative guy. I mean, he followed John McCain on the campaign trail in 2000. Wait, no, I don't have the year handy, but anyway, in the 2000s when McCain was running for president, he followed him around against Obama.
So it would have been 2007, right?
Yeah, I guess it would have been because it was towards the end. Yeah, and
something like that.
And it wasn't in a like I'm gonna try and like point out how bad McCain is. It's like I want to see if McCain's really as honest as the sort of branding is. Like he had hope for that McCain was the real deal. Basically.
That was the Palin one, wasn't it?
It was. Yeah.
Fun.
So anyway, I just kind of want to put that note in there. And at this time, as a 19, 20 years old, he's actually thinking about politics. And then if you're going to Amherst, you could go to a worse college to get your start in a career in politics, right? You're in a glee club with the Prince of Monaco. And not that the Prince of Monaco is that helpful to get a state Senate seat, but it's good to know these people.
Sure. Hey, Prince, can you write me a reference letter for politics?
Right, for politics. Yes, to politics. Yeah. So anyway, he starts dating this girl here who's at home in Illinois, not at Amherst. She's actually a psych major at Indiana University. Her name's Susie Perkins. It's his first sort of significant romantic relationship. It's kind of on again, off again. We might not circle back around to it, but it's there. And it's important to note that she's like a girl from back home. She's not an Amherst girl. And I just want to plant that as the sort of a understanding his mentality. There were two things that he leaves school. He basically leaves school because he can't handle it psychologically. He's having breakdowns and anxiety attacks. He leaves. And there's two things that help him get back on track. One is getting more into the analytical philosophy and logic side of his academic career, right? Getting really serious about that, which I think is interesting because to me it sounds like and this is sort of psychologizing, but to me I think there was an aspect of like, okay, something about my brain doesn't work right. I'm smart. I'm good with words. Maybe I can figure out like a 2 + 2 = 4 solution to why life doesn't feel meaningful to me. Maybe there's an equation, a formula, a logical sequence of words in which I can convince myself that it's meaningful somehow, right? Something airtight that I can't question. I think that's part of the logic.
Yeah. It reminds me of somebody who maybe falls into chess. I am into chess now. I am going to become a master at chess, and I'm going to read about it, know all the openings, and master it, and become extraordinarily good at this one thing because every game starts the same way, and it's something that I can control.
Right.
Yeah.
It was also excuse me, it was also the first thing that he said made and this really stuck out to me, the logic side of philosophy. It made something click in his brain, and it made me think about, remember the character of Brick in Cat on a Hot Tin Roof talking about drinking?
Sure.
Yeah,
Click.
that click. And that, when I read that, I was like, oh, I think that's what it is. I think this is what the books are about. I think this is what the drugs for him are later about, the weed, the women. And I think all of it is trying to get that little click to happen. Philosophy's doing it for him at 1920. It wouldn't do it for him forever. He goes on.
Thank Christ. Oh man. I mean, some of the philosophy professors I had, you look at them and you think, oh, maybe one day I'd like to be a professor. And you just go, no, maybe not. If this is what this looks like, God love you.
Yeah.
I don't know. Maybe I'm gonna go over here.
Right. I'm gonna go over here for a minute. Yeah.
He's got the dress shirt tucked in and no belt.
Right.
starting to have feelings about this.
We're
here to study epistemology. How about you study the JCPenney's menswear department? Professor,
not that
no
hard.
belt. Yeah.
Well, this is funny. When David Foster Wallace went around a couple circuits, he'd been around the block a few times. He goes to Harvard to study. He's like, I'm going to get my PhD in philosophy from Harvard. That's later.
A good school.
It is a good school. Everybody knows that's a good school. And I don't know who's directing the CIA now, but the future director is probably at Harvard. And he goes there and he has a similar experience to what you're saying, sort of, where he's just like, he gets there and he's like, oh, I don't belong here. Like, I don't have anything in common with any of these people. Like,
oh wow,
this was
he gets into the PhD program in philosophy at Harvard.
Yeah.
Okay,
yeah,
that's crazy.
We're going to talk about it more. Yeah.
Wait, are you?
A bunch of other stuff happens before that. Yeah.
Okay.
A bunch of other stuff happens before that.
Yeah, that is not easy.
No, not at all. So other thing I said, that the logical philosophy stuff gets him sort of back on track, back into Amherst. The other thing is tofranil, brand name for imipramine, which was the first tricyclic antidepressant, an early drug that came out of the 1950s explosion of psychiatric meds and has now been basically replaced by SSRIs. So tofranil was his first prescribed psychiatric medication.
I take tofranil every morning and work on logic problems. Tofranil. If this, then that.
That's pretty good.
That'll be $18,000 for the read. You're welcome.
That sounds fair, really. I mean, you can't afford not to buy that.
It'd be really funny if I said tofranil side effects may include bad podcasting, not enough Twitter followers, inability to monetize YouTube.
12,000, writing a 12,000 page book that everybody claims to read. He gets back to Amherst, spring of 1983, and he actually seems to be on track. He's reuniting with friends. They start working on a sort of Harvard Lampoon type publication where they're all writing stuff and putting articles and things together. And he's starting to find literature that makes the click. And the stuff that really, he's a pretty well-read kid, but what really starts to kick it off for him is postmodernism. Bartlemy's The Balloon, Pynchon's Crying of Lot 49, and Gravity's Rainbow, which apparently, supposedly he read Gravity's Rainbow in 8 nights, which sounds insane to me. And this kind of stuff. And this is the stuff that really he's somebody who'd been very interested in philosophy, like logic problems, right? And then he starts to read this fiction and is like, oh, this is what I like doing. This is interesting, right?
Yeah, that tracks. Those are two trains coming into the station together.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Now, but by the fall of that year, he is again in heavy depression. And I want to read this a little bit from the bio again. Quote, quietly, Wallace again thought about hurting himself. McLaughlin was on his mind. This is a friend of his, McLaughlin. During their hours in the womb, which was a study area they called it the womb, Wallace had debated suicide with McLaughlin. Music playing, they kicked around the fate of Ian Curtis of Joy Division, who hanged himself at the age of 23. In high school, McLaughlin himself had once stood on the edge of an overpass with a bottle of champagne in one hand, contemplating throwing himself onto the Illinois tollway. For McLaughlin, killing yourself could be the fitting, maybe even necessary, exit for the sensitive artist from the brutal world. Wallace, though he'd known a despair deeper than his friends could imagine, wasn't so sure. Suicide looked to him like an escape rather than a solution. He knew depression too well to see it as glamorous. He looked around for ways to harm himself, but decided instead to withdraw from school again and find a psychiatrist. So, second time he's taking a leave of absence for mental health reasons, right? 1983, it's his junior year, I guess. He comes back,
and he's already on this medication.
Yeah, he's been on this medication for 6 months or something by this time. Yeah.
Oof. Yeah.
They do take him off the medication. They kind of decide that this tofranil is not going to work. They try some other things. It's just becoming clear that this isn't just a contextual thing, though. Like, there is a point where it's like, earlier in his life is like, you could blame it on a bunch of things. High school is weird and kind of sucks for a lot of people, right? College, you're trying to adjust to a new environment or whatever. But at this point, he's just like, oh no, this is like a thing that lives inside of me that never really goes away. And this is sort of dawning on him in this second breakdown. This really starts to become obvious for him. I have another little bit to read here too, that's related to this. Okay. This is a note he sort of wrote to himself and he put on his bulletin board at home. The bad thing is you, he concludes, echoing the caption under the Kafka picture he had on his bulletin board. And then the letter continues. The bad thing is you, nothing else. You are the sickness yourself. You realize all this here. And that, I guess, is when you look at the black hole and it's wearing your face. That's when the bad thing just absolutely eats you up, or rather when you just eat yourself up, when you kill yourself. All this business about people committing suicide when they're, quote, severely depressed. We say, holy cow, we must do something to stop them from killing themselves. That's wrong, because all these people have, you see, by this time already killed themselves where it really counts. When they commit suicide, they're just being orderly. So he writes this at like 20 years old, right?
Yeah.
It's tough, man. It's easy to just.
This is a guy.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, this is a guy who likes orderly things too. The fields and the shape of a tennis court and.
What do you do with this thing? He goes back to school. He gets back to Amherst, spring of '84. New commitment to writing fiction. It's probably spring of 1984 where he decides, like, this is what I want to do. This is what I'm going to do, right?
Almost the worst thing that could happen. You send your son to a highly esteemed liberal arts college and he decides to become a writer.
Yeah. David, I
Disaster.
thought you were going to become director of the CIA. What is this I hear?
Well, I took the career aptitude test, and yeah, sure, it says I should be the director of the CIA, but I really want to sing and dance and write 1,200-page novels.
Yeah. Oh man.
Yeah, it's just like, oh my God.
Okay, whatever.
We're never gonna financially recover from this.
That's why he had to work. That's why he had to work at University of Illinois for 50 years, probably. It's a long time. He was so he's very interested in writing fiction, but then he takes a fiction writing course. Remember the kinds of writers he was interested in at that time, right? And you could add to that now people like T.S. Eliot and Derrida. He takes a fiction writing course. He's disappointed to find that the only thing they're really teaching is like mainstream realist fiction. You're talking about, sure, like Raymond Carver. It's not bad. It's just not. That didn't make the click. And David Foster Wallace said that's not what he's there for, right? Later, he would come to really appreciate that kind of stuff, but at this time, that doesn't mean anything to him. He's in irony mode. He's in self-reflexivity, breaking the fourth wall, disrupt all the intellectual, all the stuff that makes postmodernism cool, but also all the stuff that makes it gimmicky as a literary style, right? Has to be done. This is the stuff that kind of turns him on. He would describe his entry point to writing fiction not as like sensitivity to the interiority of people. So not about character. It's really about the fact that he was an incredibly good forger or mimic. He's called himself a forger, but a mimic. He could write in anybody's style. And a lot of his early stuff are like deliberate, like parodies of other writers. It's like, what if Frank Norris wrote a story about this? What if, what if Pynchon wrote a story about this? That was kind of how that was. A lot of his very early stuff was like that. Yeah. Oh, nah, I will skip that. I was going to read part from Pale King, but I think we're going to skip that. Anyway,
there's that tennis metaphor coming back again, right? He's like hitting the ball back and probably picking up shots like, oh, this guy's got some spin. I'll put the same spin on it and give it right back. I can play the whole court. Right.
And and then those styles, they become just tools. And again, you're talking about somebody who's got, for all his issues, very high IQ. He can keep these plates spinning. He can figure out why does Pynchon sound like Pynchon? Why does Kafka sound like Kafka? He can pick all that up on like a syntactical level, right? And just churn it right back out. Now, here's another interesting bit. So by the time he's ready to leave Amherst, this writing project has turned from a few short stories into a novel, The Broom of the System. Now, as he's writing The Broom of the System, he's becoming this sort of eccentric celebrity on campus. He gets his own room as a senior, which is apparently what happens at Amherst. You get your own room by yourself. He's taking this course on literature of madness. He's getting deep into Wittgenstein, who, by the way, we're going to do season 4 of Wittgenstein. Gets into tobacco now, smoking. And then
you're going to do Wittgenstein?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. That'll be fun.
Yeah.
I'm ready. I know a little bit about old Witty. Yeah.
Okay. I don't know much about him, except
okay.
I know a little bit.
We're going to go on a learning journey together.
Yeah. It'll be fun. I look forward to it. Tobacco. I was saying he picks up tobacco senior year of college, smoking, chewing. It would kind of be with him for most of the rest of his life. Just a note. He is writing hard now too, like the way he used to watch TV, right? Sometimes
tobacco was made for this guy. Nicotine and this guy, impossible to imagine him without.
Yeah, I don't know how he would have gotten out, not gotten trapped by it, right?
Unreal.
Yeah. He's writing so hard though. There's anecdotal stories about he writes 24 pages in 3 hours one time. He which is a lot, full text pages. He would get so excited that like he would have to go to the gym and work out until he threw up to like burn off energy so he could calm himself down. It's very, very intense. And what he's working on is the book, The Broom of the System. He submits this as one arm of a double-barreled undergraduate thesis, the other being a paper on the philosopher Richard Taylor's concept of fatalism. I don't know if you've ever heard of Richard Taylor's fatalism, if this is familiar to you at all. I looked into a little bit, and it seems like one of these things. To summarize Taylor's fatalism, is something like this. All statements about the future are true or false. So then how can our actions now have any influence over how things turn out? It's one of these like language game things that like sounds like it's like this airtight logical thing, but to me is like stupid on the face of it. So anyway, David Foster Wallace's essay, his undergraduate thesis was a refutation of that, which apparently was fairly well acclaimed.
Taylor also made significant contributions to beekeeping. He owned 300 hives of bees and from 1970 produced mostly comb honey. And he wrote about this in his books. So He was a philosopher and a beekeeper.
Okay, I like that.
Yeah.
That's charming.
Little
Yeah.
footnote.
Yeah, why not? That's charming. Um, this is funny. Okay, so he turns in. Oh, one of the reasons he wanted to do this double thesis thing was because his buddy Mark Costello had done it, and he'd been like the only person in recent memory to do that. Mark Costello had been. So David Foster Wallace was like, well, I gotta do at least as good as he did, right? So this is why he does this double thesis thing. Very competitive, right? But again, you've got that like Gen X sort of like you have to kind of pretend not to care thing at the same time, but also like intensely competitive at the same time, which is, I think, the thing that kind of made him crazy, or one of the things.
Yeah. Someone in the chat is saying that apparently Bret Easton Ellis felt that Wallace picked up his style and was ripping off Ellis's writing for Broom of the System.
Oh, that could very well be. Yeah. They mentioned that in the biography. I think that's probably partially true. It's not like plagiarism. Again, it's this mimic thing. It's like he can just write and sound like anybody he wants to sound like. And I think it's that. Yeah. And Wallace was conscious of that. And another person that he was sort of compared to was Pynchon, particularly Crying of Lot 49. And he would tell early interviewers that he'd never read that book because he'd taken the style pretty deliberately. Anyway, he gets an A- for the Broom of the System as his undergraduate thesis and graduates with a total of 10 awards, which may have actually been an Amherst record. They give out awards for things like highest GPA and that kind of thing. Yeah, well, not just highest GPA, like every year, you get it as like every college or university has it at the end, right?
Voted most likely to assassinate a foreign leader.
That's right. His name's redacted here, but he knows who he is. Yeah. So he gets an A- for Broom of the System. He gets it and then he gets Broom of the System published when he's 25 years old, right? So
what do you take that to an agent or a publisher and you go, hey, I got an A- at Amherst on this novel.
Yeah, and they're like, all right, book it.
Okay,
yeah.
I guess.
Yeah. Now this didn't, and we'll talk a little bit more about this. I'll give you like a little sense of just like what Broom of the System is. I put one word here at first, just Pynchon. It's taking a lot from Pynchon, which is fine. We all borrow, especially early. I'll give you just the plot. This is just from Wikipedia. It's just so you're following along with the kind of stuff he's doing. The Broom of the System centers on the comparatively normal Lenore Beadsman, a 24-year-old telephone switchboard operator who gets caught in the middle of a Cleveland-based character drama. In Wallace's typically offbeat style, Lenore navigates three separate crises: her great-grandmother's escape from a nursing home, a neurotic boyfriend, and a suddenly vocal pet cockatiel. The controlling idea surrounding all of these crises is the use of words and symbols to define a person. To illustrate this idea, Wallace uses different formats to build the story, including transcripts from television recordings and therapy sessions, as well as an accompanying fictional account written by one of the main characters named Rick Vigorous.
Rick Vigorous.
Yeah, which is a very Pynchon way to name a character. And I suppose Pynchon didn't invent that kind of thing either.
Definitely, it sounds like a late 80s, early 90s era WWF.
Yeah, right. But also like weirdly like a vulgar Charles Dickens character too, sort of a little bit.
Yeah,
like Dickens wouldn't have actually named a character that, but yeah. Let me just read just a little bit, because again, I want to give you a little bit of David Foster Wallace voice. This is from The Broom of the System. Quote, "Most really pretty girls have pretty ugly feet. And so does Mindy Meadowman," Lenore notices all of a sudden. "They're long and thin and splay-toed, with buttons of yellow callus on the little toes and a thick stair-step of it on the back of the heel, and a few long black hairs are curling out of the skin at the tops of the feet, and the red nail polish is cracking and peeling and curls and candy-striped with decay. Lenore only notices because Mindy's bent over in the chair by the fridge, picking at some of the polish on her toes. Her bathrobe's opening a little, so there's some cleavage visible and everything. A lot more than Lenore's got, and the white thick towel wrapped around Mindy's wet-washed, shampooed head is coming undone, and a wisp of dark, shiny hair has slithered out of a crack in the folds and curled down all demurely past the side of Mindy's face and under her chin. It smells like Fleck shampoo in the room, and also pot, since Clarice and Sue Shaw are smoking a big, thick Jaybird Lenore got from Ed Creamer back at Shaker School and brought up with some other stuff for Clarice here at school. So that doesn't, whatever. Maybe that's amazing. Maybe it's not. I don't know. Let me see. Moving. Oh, okay. So
don't tell me he's a foot guy.
I don't know. I don't think there's a lot of evidence elsewhere in his work of that.
Okay.
It's not like a thing to my knowledge that's like recurring.
Because I was ready to kill the episode right there.
Stop it.
I don't think we've had a foot guy yet.
Not that we're aware of. A lot of people keep that to themselves.
Yeah. Fair enough.
Yeah.
He's just got just a photo book full of like Thatcher Photoshop fake Thatcher feet pics. It's Thatcher in front of Big Ben with their feet up.
Yeah, with their feet up.
Here's Thatcher at the Eiffel Tower.
Right. Oh, God.
I just see a couple of pictures of feet here, David.
Yeah. That's Thatcher. Can't you tell? That's Thatcher's feet. It's got to be what, 82, 83? It's Thatcher.
Baroness Thatcher's feet. Why wouldn't it be? You're listening to Art of Darkness, a podcast about the dark side of creativity. You can find us at artofdarkpod.com and on Patreon at patreon.com/artofdarkpod. And we already got a couple of things we're going to talk about on the After Dark, Brad. You teased we're going to do a little bit about the Pale King, the suicide, which of course no spoilers. We know we're coming to it. And then I've got this list of books. It's going to be a blast.
Yeah. Writes, as you said, writes Broom in the System, published in 1985. He goes, but he graduates Amherst. Before that, he goes to Arizona for his MFA. So he's graduated from his MFA and he has a published novel that's gotten very little attention. But as somebody who has an MFA, Kevin, if you get there the first day and somebody's like, oh yeah, I just had a novel come out like from a normal publisher, you're like, oh,
everybody's gonna hate you. They're all gonna hate you.
Yeah, exactly.
And or want to know your agent, and or want to know your publisher, and or pretend that they don't care.
Right.
But in fact, the MFA program is like a cauldron of egos is a real thing.
Yeah.
Arizona
for
an MFA.
He was going to go to Iowa. The idea, but Iowa, he wasn't confident that he could get it paid for, that he would get the scholarship, and at Arizona he could get a scholarship. And also Iowa was very much about that realistic kind of fiction that he wasn't interested in, right? And Arizona,
never pay for an MFA. On the record from two of us.
That's I learned a lot of my MFA, but that was maybe the most important thing I learned.
The only MFA you need to pay for is the Art of Darkness MFA, which is unofficial. You know what? Listen, if you become a patron on Patreon and you're a patron for over a year and you want Brad and me to write you a letter of recommendation for politics, or to send you, we'll do both. We'll send you an MFA made in Photoshop with Comic Sans, and there'll be a lot of fine print. I'm deadly serious. We will print you an MFA. From
it might
Art of
say
Darkness.
Master of Fine Arts or something like that. But yes, it will be. I can guarantee it will be a certificate.
I think everybody who's been a patron for over a year is an honorary MFA.
I like that. That's quite funny. Okay. Summer before the MFA, that golden time when you know you're about to go to an MFA and you can't really do anything else, right? He's back in Urbana, Illinois, and things don't go particularly well. He has a depressive episode. And this is when he finally gets diagnosed with something I'd never quite heard the definition of before, called atypical depression, The key characteristics of atypical depression are an unusual sensitivity to social rejection and a quick return to mental health when circumstances improve.
It sounds like everybody in the group chat.
I was gonna say that sounds like everybody I know. Anyway,
that's an odd one.
Yeah, clearly he has a significant. I'm not making light of the fact that he has a significant bad thing going, but just that definition sounds like okay. I sleep when I'm tired, and I sleep until I'm not tired anymore. I have a sleep disorder. It seems like a weird way to put it. Anyway, he gets put on Nardil, an older MAO inhibitor. Common side effects of Nardil, which is the brand name for phenelzine, may include dizziness, blurry vision, dry mouth, headaches, lethargy, sedation, somnolence, insomnia, anorexia, weight gain or loss, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, constipation, urinary retention, mydriasis, muscle tremors, hyperthermia, sweating, hypertension, hypotension, orthostatic hypotension, paresthesia, hepatitis, somehow, sexual dysfunction.
What? Hepatitis is a side effect?
It says what it says. I don't know how that. I thought hepatitis is like a virus. How does that make any sense?
I don't think science is real, to be honest. I really don't.
I think this is just a list of words.
Increasingly just don't think it's real.
Right. Oh, rare side effects. Hypomania, or just mania, psychosis, acute liver failure, the last of which is usually only seen in people with pre-existing liver damage, old age, long-term effects of alcohol consumption. That could be a problem, or viral infection. So this is a pretty serious medication to be on.
Nardil, when you want to contract hepatitis without the fun. Can you imagine?
Am I going to spend a lot of time on the hepatitis Wikipedia page for a number of reasons?
Sure.
But that was a surprising side effect to see on here.
Nardil, put some hep in your step. That'll be $18,000.
Man, we're making a lot of money on this episode. This is great.
The pharmaceutical reads, they pay. They pay. Turns out the biggest international criminal cartel has deep pockets.
They do. Yep. And
Nardil,
they're unscrupulous in how they spend their marketing money too.
Amazing, yeah. And Nardil, just throw it at any podcast. Nardil sounds like the sort of runt youngest sibling in like an old timey Viking story who comes out up and like destroys the family. Right. And then Nardil slayed Grandil. Right. And yay, the land was disturbeth. Yes. We gotta laugh on this pod once in a while, man, because otherwise we're in real trouble. We're in a lot of trouble because this is heavy.
We're laughing because it's like, yeah, he's taking this because he's, on the verge of psychological collapse. Okay, he gets to Arizona. He does have, again, since anybody, young person, when you move, you get the sort of chance to reinvent yourself a little bit. He had taken to explaining this gap in his Amherst time as having to take school off because a friend of his committed suicide. And he was never very clear with anybody about those actual times. And even later on, when he became sort of famous, there was always a lot of like contradictory sort of presenting yourself as being very forthcoming, but also like hiding key parts of this stuff, the drugs, and it's fair enough. I mean, he doesn't owe anybody in public an explanation for any of this stuff, right?
David, can you explain this gap in your resume? No. Giga Chad GIF. Right.
I saw on the internet the other day, somebody said, well, when somebody asks you that, just say NDA.
I was under an NDA.
Yeah,
I am under an NDA. Right. Yeah, very good.
Yeah.
Epic.
Yeah. So things go pretty well in Arizona, actually, for a little while. He's got this crappy little apartment in Tucson, but he's 23 years old, and that's all he needs. He's got some love interests. His insecurity, he tends to do something with his insecurity at various times in his life, which is to sort of sublimate it into a fairly intense kind of arrogance. I'm going to read you a little bit about that from the bio.
He does seem like that guy a little bit.
Yeah. Quote, Wallace was not a tentative freshman anymore. He had matured, if not emotionally, then at least socially, and graduate programs familiar to him from his childhood were easier for him to navigate than undergraduate life at a preppy school. He knew where the levers of academic control were and how to work them, but he still had no gift when it came to human interactions. His default mode was to show off in a way that struck others as less than nice. How well do you know Pynchon's work? He would ask when he met a fellow student. That's annoying. Excuse me, he said, overhearing a fellow say nauseous when she meant nauseated. My mother's an English teacher, and I would have to tell you the way you're using that word is wrong. He would tell an interviewer in 1999 in reference to this time, I was kind of a prick. It's also around this time that he gets the bandana. The bandana starts off, he's living in there, and it starts off kind of reasonably. He's got shaggy hair. He's living in Arizona. He's staying indoors writing most of the time. And all he has is a swamp cooler. Kevin, I don't know if you're familiar with the swamp cooler. It's the sort of predecessor to the actual air conditioning unit, where basically you have like a thing of water that like in a fan that blows over it. It's all contained in one mechanism, but they don't really work. They pretty much just blow like muggy air that's about 5 degrees colder than it is outside in your
sounds a lot like the drugs they have him on.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So that's how the bandana starts, and I can see that you're trying to write. He writes by hand, so you're trying to write and you're sweating. You got to put something on your head. It makes total sense to start.
I judge him a lot less severely now, knowing that the bandana is almost a kind of what do they call it? It's sort of a medical device. It's I mean, it's like occupational therapist.
Yeah.
What do you do? I write and I sweat everywhere. Gives him the bandana. The bandana glows like the sun the first time he puts it on. This is amazing.
Right. This has solved all of my problems. Yeah. But
I'm going to wear this in every picture for the rest of my life.
That's a good idea, Dave. Yeah. What could go wrong? Okay, so this is from the David Lipsky book, although of course you end up becoming yourself. David Lipsky asks, and the whole conceit of this book is they're driving around during his book tour for Infinite Jest, and David Lipsky is interviewing him over the course of like 10 days or 2 weeks or something like that. And so it's fairly candid conversations, in the car, smoking cigarettes and eating junk food, that kind of thing. And also David Foster Wallace is like literally during the trip becoming more famous every day. Right. So it's an interesting kind of like process. He's sort of in the midst of that happening. So David Lipsky says, tell me about the bandana stuff we were talking about yesterday. And this is back to David. I started wearing bandanas in Tucson because it was 100 degrees all the time. When it's really hot, I would perspire so much that I would drip on the page. Actually, I started wearing it that year, and then it became a big help in Yaddo in 87 because I would drip into the typewriter, and I was worried that I was going to get a shock. We're going to talk about Yaddo a little bit later. And then I discovered that I felt better with them on. And then I, for a while, dated a woman she was actually a Sufi Muslim, but she knew a lot she was like a 60s lady, and she knew all about all kinds of different stuff. And she said that there were these various chakras. And one of the big ones was what she called the spout hole at the very top of your cranium. And in a lot of cultures, it was considered better to keep your head covered. And then I began thinking about the phrase keeping your head together, I mean, I don't wear it all the time. I wear it. I know it's a security blanket for me. Whenever I'm nervous or whenever I feel like I have to be prepared or keep myself together, I tend to wear it. It makes me like last night we laughed. It made me feel kind of creepy that people view it as an affectation or a trademark or something. It's more just a foible. It's the recognition of a weakness, which is that I'm just kind of worried my head's going to explode. And then David Lipsky says, people just think it's a way you're trying to connect with the younger reading audience. Wallace, I don't know very many Gen Xers who wear headbands. The worst thing about here is, in the Southwest, people wear them all the time. And in New York, there's a certain kind of hip way to dress that involves them. Here, one reason I got these plain white ones is that people thought I was a biker. Here it spells affiliation with Harley clubs. And I just don't need that shit, It's hard enough to get a cab as it is. And then Lipsky, but people thinking it's a commercial gesture. Wallace. No, I don't know what to say. I guess in a way, I don't even want you to have brought this up, because now I'm worrying that it's going to be intentional. Like if I don't wear it, then am I not wearing it because I'm bowing to other people's perceptions that it's a commercial choice? Or do I do what I want, even though it's perceived as commercial? And it's just like one more crazy circle to go around.
That is a hot shot of what was going on in the 90s. Was this the 90s?
Yeah, this would have been 96. Yeah.
Yeah, that I could have almost that we're talking about. Is he a sellout? Is he for real? Is this an affectation? That was the height of that period. The internet was just kind of coming along. Everybody didn't have it in their house quite yet. And cable had been around for a while. That was a huge moment. We talk about this, like, is he a sellout? What's with the bandana? Every single square inch of every photo scrutinized for authenticity,
right,
legitimacy, and
yeah, and it's sort of like who won, what side won that conversation, sort of like.
Well, it still goes on now, but it's like we just sort of acquiesce to it, and it's now it's the water we swim in. Back then, it used to be like a high-powered water gun. You'd spray at somebody. Now it's just
you could say one word and destroy somebody. Like it's sell out.
Yeah.
And it's funny because you could say that and you're always pretty much right, because everybody is to some extent. You know what I mean?
Right. I remember like growing up in North Dakota,
you got a part-time job.
It's like, I just want to say, like, we've heard about them in North Dakota. They've got something going on. Somebody sold something.
Right.
We bought it, didn't we?
Right. Yeah. Interesting. So, okay. Back to the school thing. Arizona, David Foster Wallace continuing to write. Obviously, that's what he's there for. He's working on some stories that wind up in his first collection, which is called, where do I have it here someplace? Girl with Curious Hair, based on the story called Girl with Curious Hair. Excuse me. But he's running into these sort of constraints. I mean, there was this sort of idea that Arizona was going to be a little bit more experimental. The stories in this book, if someone were to say, I don't like Girl with Curious Hair at all, I wouldn't even argue with them. This is very much like a taste thing. Like if it works for you, then it does. But no one's going to argue like, this is infallible. This is good. It's very weird. Every story is kind of a thought experiment. It definitely, to me, has its moments, but the moments are sort of few and far between. And we're going to talk a little bit more about it. Let me give you and in writing these, he was starting to get a lot of resistance from his professors. He was starting to get a lot of like, David, you have to write a story. Well, I don't want to write that realist crap. He's like, yes, but people still have to care enough to read it. Like they're trying to give him like the basics of like, listen, like people have to want to flip the page, right? Okay. You don't have to have
just be normal, David.
Just be normal. Please be normal.
Just be a little normal, slightly normal.
Right.
Give us something to hang on to, David.
Yeah. Now later in his career, he would come back when he was a teacher, he would come back and basically say some of the very same things that his professors in this MFA program were saying. But he had to go like the long way around to get to this stuff, right? Which is just I think it's just a different route to get to some of the basics, like make a character people like. Or if they don't like, they have fun not liking them, right?
That's make a character interesting.
Right.
This is an interesting character. I wonder what will happen to this character.
Right.
The word character starts with the word care.
Right. There you go. Or a little bit of that, like, hey, this is a situation I sort of recognize. Like anything that like
I wonder what's going to happen next.
Right. He wasn't very good at doing that. Now, let me give you. Now, I say that, and yet there is some good stuff in here. Let me give you I'm going to give you just a quick summary of this book. We're not going to read any actual parts from it, but here's the titles and the quick 2-sentence summaries of some of these stories. Little Expressionless Animals is one story. This is one that David Wallace, he really liked even later on. revolves around a unique winning streak on the TV show Jeopardy and the coming together of two lesbians with abnormal childhoods. Another one is called Luckily, the Account Representative Knew CPR. This is two executives at an unnamed corporation meet in the underground parking lot while leaving late, and the senior executive suddenly has a heart attack. Girl with a Curious Hair is about a sadistic young Republican lawyer who associates with punk rockers, spending an evening with his drugged friends at a Keith Jarrett concert, where his LSD-influenced girlfriend is obsessed with the titular Girl with Curious Hair. The story Lyndon is a fictional account of a young man named David Boyd working closely with American President Lyndon B. Johnson and getting personally entangled. The story John Billy has a narrator with an exaggerated Southern dialect recounting the tale of his town's favorite son and the consequences of his quest for revenge. Here and There is a story about a boy and girl. That one doesn't really have much in plot. The story My Appearance is about an actress who appears on Late Night with David Letterman while her television producer husband obsessively coaches her. According to Boswell, this is somebody who wrote a lot about Wallace, this is the most important and successful story in the collection. It was published in Playboy magazine later on. It was called Late Night when it was published in Playboy. And then maybe the most important for the evolution of Wallace's work, it was the final story called Westward the Course of Empire Takes Its Way, which is actually a 150-page novella. And this is what Boswell has to say about it. Quote, taken on its own, this is an engaging piece of pretentious juvenilia. Read as a precursor to Infinite Jest, it stands as a fascinating programmatic declaration of intent. So it's a little bit like a fictionalized manifesto. It's like a, and we'll talk a little bit more about it. It's sort of like a literary manifesto with a story sort of sitting kind of on top of it. Let's see. So
yeah, no, I don't want to read any of that.
No, not really.
Yeah.
I would say the one that is probably the best to read, Westward the Course of the Empire Takes Its Way. I don't think it quite justifies itself. That's my personal opinion. I do think the one My Appearance, the one about the woman on David Letterman, is actually a pretty good read.
Well, there's his TV obsession coming back, and
some of it he was like quotes lifted directly from airings of David Letterman. So like he got into almost got into some legal trouble with that actually. So we'll talk a little bit about Westward the Course of the Empire Takes Its Way. As I said, because it marks this sort of pivot point in his evolution, right? The way that I'm thinking about David Foster Wallace, if I can summarize it as neatly as I can, his evolution as a writer is like brilliant mind. Forget if you like him as a writer or not. Brilliant mind messes around for a while. These weird stories, sort of ironic thought experiment kind of stuff. Realizes that that's pointless after his second book and spends the rest of his life trying to figure out, if that's pointless, what should I do? Right. So it's sort of like it's even that psychological thing where he's constantly folding in on himself. He's doing it here too. He's like, all right, well, oh, look, you can play this game. That makes the click go. Oh, wait, what's the point of the game? And then, 20 some years trying to figure out what the next game is. Sure. And he does.
Yeah. You can think, or you can think about.
Yeah.
This is a guy who thinks about thinking.
Yes, 100%. Yeah. Let's see. So, I want to read something in his.
As you do, I will be topping up my water. I have not gone anywhere. I am listening. Gotcha. Wrapped. I can't wait to find out what happens next, because you've helped create a character on Art of Darkness.
Oh yeah, you know what happens to him, and he's a little interesting, and you're not sure how you feel about him, and something's coming. And
I'm pulling for young David here.
For
insufferable, very Reddit. Young David. Yeah. I hope he makes it.
Yeah. So this is a bit from the bio on his, like I was saying, his sort of evolution from being this sort of ironic, obsessed with postmodernism. And I'm not going to go on a whole thing about what do I mean by postmodernism. Just know that when we talk about living in the postmodern era, literary postmodernism is a specific style that you can describe in a lot of ways, but isn't the same thing as saying we're living in the postmodern era or this is postmodernism. It's a specific kind of writing that has particular aesthetic, philosophical, and sort of, I guess, intentional missions baked into it as a genre. There are, Pynchon would be one of them. David Foster Wallace is arguably one of them, but he's almost like, when we get to Infinite Jest, he's almost like this postmodern in a way. And a number of others, Italo Calvino, a bunch of people. And so when I say that I'm talking about the specific style. Now, another example of postmodernism is Barth's Lost in the Funhouse, a hugely influential story. And Westward, The Course of the Empire Takes Its Way. It was an important story for Wallace, but Westward, The Course of the Empire Takes Its Way sort of tries to grapple with some of the same problems as Lost in the Funhouse and sort of comes to a different conclusion. I'm going to read from the biography. Quote, Wallace also had come to feel that there was something irritating about Lost in the Funhouse. Remember, a story he had loved. Condescending, and if you were a recursive cast of mind, false about the way Barth kept breaking into the narrative to show readers falsity. Didn't such an intrusion in the end just create more of a performance? Wasn't it seduction pretending to be renunciation? How in the end did Barth really propose to challenge or reward the reader? Preparing to rebut Barth in his own story, Wallace scribbled notes in the margins of his paperback of the Lost in the Funhouse story collection, contesting sentences and penning criticisms like, quote, Talmudic, obsessed with its own interpretation, alongside Barth's words. It was clear that metafiction no longer satisfied Wallace as it once had. But just after his last semester at Arizona, when he probably began his new story, he himself likely couldn't tell whether he was writing an homage, a parody, a eulogy, or an act of patricide. The desire to get out what he had to say was made more intense by a sense that his old life was ending. This was the time for last things, for summings up, for boiling the whole of the fictive act, at least as practiced in MFA programs, down to, as he would later tell in an interview, this tiny, infinitely dense thing. A little bit further down. Like Funhouse, Westward, The Course of the Empire Takes Its Way is the story of a group of young people on a car trip. But instead of Barth's ordinary American teenagers, Wallace gives us MFA students. Great. I want a 150-page novella about MFA students. And rather than go to a beach, they're on a more typically postmodern errand. They're on the way to the town of Collision, Illinois, for a reunion of the 44,000, quote, former actors, actresses, puppeteers, and unemployed clowns who had ever taken part in a McDonald's commercial. At the same time, there will be a ribbon cutting for a flagship discotheque of a new company whose goal is to build a funhouse in every major market. Running this effort to add a whole new dimension in Alone Fun are two people, Leo Burnett, the advertising guru, and none other than John Barth, the metafictionist called here Professor Ambrose. Wallace's suggestion is clear. Advertising and metafiction share the same goal, to lull by pleasing, to fatten without nourishing. So he tried to put a stake in the heart of metafiction with this last story in Girl with the Curious Hair.
Okay.
Yeah. So the problem is we're talking more about the biography here. And again, I'm trying to illustrate his evolution, his sort of artistic evolution. Westward is sort of like move west beyond this metafictional, quote, postmodern stuff. And yet he doesn't know what's to the west yet. It's a blank spot on the map to him. And it's going to take him some time to try and figure out something to put on that map. And, weirdly, a lot of times he's going to fall into the habits of metafiction and postmodern aesthetic trying to get there. And I don't think he really, really gets there, honestly, until The Pale King, which we're going to talk about more on the After Dark.
Is DeLillo on his radar? Big time, huh?
Yeah. DeLillo, okay. He and DeLillo eventually, not quite at this point, but a few years after where we're at now, they start up a correspondence and they write letters to each other regularly.
I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah.
Of that group, DeLillo's my favorite.
Yeah. I mean,
DeLillo has a humanity that, to me, seems to exceed the others, and an ability to write a story that on its face has a certain even commercial appeal.
mhm.
But then he can also just completely do that Pomo thing.
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
Underworld to me, I mean, if we're going to talk about it, to me, and this is again just my opinion, when you think about like the sort of the tenets or the principles of the postmodern literary style, the best thing that most easily fits, if this makes sense, the best book that most easily fits into that category is Don DeLillo's Underworld. It does all of the postmodern song and dance. It does everything, but it's better to me. It's better than all of them.
He's great.
Yeah.
Yeah. DeLillo is the tops. Big
Mhm.
fan.
And I mean, and that's not even his best book, in my
No,
Libra.
yeah, I wouldn't say
So,
it is. You think Libra? Okay, wait, this is going to be a DeLillo pod, but okay, all right.
It's Libra or White Noise. Anyway, okay. 1986, 1980 to 1987, Wallace's scholarship runs out, and he has to take on some teaching at University of Arizona, which he initially despises. He kind of hates doing it, right? And you can see if you're trying to just write and you go from all I have to do is write to now I got to teach, it's not the greatest transition. I mean, it sounds like, oh, it's a cush job, but you know, it's a tricky move for anybody to make. Eventually he gets very good at it. Like he becomes like a sought after teacher, but at first it's not a great fit. One thing that's kind of interesting, I think, is eventually, and this is something eventually he would do to become a teacher. Because remember, he's this like, he knew all the theory, right? He read all of the theory about writing. He knew all of like the most avant-garde writers, and he's trying to do all of those things. Later, when he becomes a good teacher, and this isn't at UA, this is years later, sometimes the first day of class, he would write the names of a bunch of theorists on the board, Derrida, Barth, you know, whoever. And he would say, listen, I know all of this stuff. You don't have to remind me of it. Right. We're here to talk about how do you write a good story. Right. So,
Yeah.
right. And it's like, he's not even saying that they're wrong. He's just like,
there's a difference between theory and practice.
Right. I don't want you to try and convince me that's a good short story because something Derrida said one time.
It's the difference between an actor showing up already knowing their lines or not.
Mm-hmm. Right.
An actor, a real actor, will show up knowing their lines.
Sure.
So let's just assume we all understand.
Right.
We've read the Wikipedia about Foucault, right, at least.
Right.
So we don't need to justify. Right. Yeah. The story justifies itself. The work always has to justify itself.
Right. And eventually Wallace got there, but it took a while. It was like he had to integrate all of that stuff and think through every aspect of it to spit himself out on the other side. Right.
Sure.
And he's in the midst of that process towards the end of his time here at UA.
How's his depression doing now? Is he seems to be functioning.
Did okay in Arizona, actually. The MFA program, I think, was okay for him. And plus, you remember, he started out, he had a novel. Nobody else in his MFA program had a published novel, right?
Sure.
Even if the reviews weren't great and the sales weren't great, and they weren't, he was still like, nobody here has anything on me. And also he did the big fish in a little pond thing instead of the going to Iowa where he would have probably been an outcast, right?
And he's getting some sun and he's got his bandana. And it's all coming together.
And he would talk for years about how attractive the women were in Arizona. He had a girlfriend there for a little while, this woman named Gail Walden. It's sort of typical of a lot of his relationships where they don't actually spend that much time together. There's a lot of uncertainty about the status from both of them. There's a sort of on again, off again quality. There's David Foster Wallace maybe sleeping with other people. There's him claiming they're together when they're clearly not. And this happens in like a handful of his relationships over time. Now, we might as well talk about this since this is happening. Listen, when it comes to his relationships to women, David Foster Wallace often behaved like a piece of shit. I'm not even going to try to sugarcoat it. If you want to read detailed articles about that stuff, they are out there. we're going to talk about it a little bit as it pertains to the biographical material, but like I don't want to pretend this isn't a thing. There's a article by this guy Devin Price called "A Brief on Hideous Things About David Foster Wallace." There's articles by Mary Carr, a woman he dated later, who we're going to talk about, who's another very good writer. He had a troubled relationship with. I don't really know what to do with it. More of this is going to come up, but until he was about 40 years old, you couldn't advise anybody to be in a relationship with him. If you knew him, if you knew a friend of yours was going to start dating him, no, honey, don't do that. Stay away. Right. And it's not a lot of physical abuse. There are here and there incidences of that. It's more self-centeredness, a little bit of that like love bombing and withdrawing thing. It's stalkerish behavior at times. It's writing in like long crazy letters. Yeah. And we're going to talk more about the Mary Carr, because Mary Carr is when it gets the most intense.
It is, I believe, in his. I'm going to do a little bit of Freudian analysis on Art of Darkness, which we try to do on every episode. Not really.
Right.
He's looking for his Thatcher. He's looking for his Iron Lady.
I think
and you're not going to find her in an MFA program in Arizona.
No, probably not. That's probably true.
He really had a Thatcher poster.
Apparently,
in high school,
in Amherst undergrad. Yeah.
And in Amherst,
he says he did. He says he did. So it's not like a room. I mean,
well, and to be clear, this podcast isn't about running cover for artists. Far from it. We've seen some horrible things in the Art of Darkness back catalog. So I'm glad we're going to touch on this, Brad. This is a little more recent. This is a very new kind of.
I mean, a lot of the people he knew are still around, and so you want to make sure you do this. We try to do justice, right? Like never hiding anything about any of those people.
No.
So I think 87, he goes to Yaddo. I don't know if you know Yaddo, Kevin.
Yaddo. Yeah. Yabba dabba Yaddo. Yeah. Yaddo is one of these leafy. They got a website and cost you $35 to apply, and maybe you get and then you can go and they'll give you a little cabin and they'll feed you breakfast and you're gonna go be a writer.
Right. Yeah, exactly. 1987, he goes to Yaddo for the first time. Big artist residency up in upstate New York. It's been running continuously since 1926.
Great, by the way.
I'm
being a little bit
I would do
sort of jokey, but 100%. I mean, artists do need these things. Yeah.
I think.
I bet people get up to some real misbehavior out there in the woods. If there's anything I know from like theater life. Wait. You're telling me like some of us are 30 and we're going to summer camp? Right. Okay. What could go wrong?
You tell me I don't have to get up at a specific time? Is that what you just said?
Right. Yeah. How much alcohol do we have? There's a lot of alcohol.
Yeah.
I'm going to remember none of this.
Right.
But it goes on the resume.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. Of course. Yeah. This is the thing.
It's called Yaddo because that's the sound you make before you pass out.
Yeah. Oh, there is somebody who everybody knows the name of who has been out in the middle of the woods out by Yaddo, drunk as hell, like screaming at the moon.
Yaddo.
That's
100%. Oh yeah.
Kevin and I sort of make fun of this stuff, the sort of prestige academia kind of ish aspect of this stuff. I think sometimes because we've sort of brushed against it, and it's I would go to Yaddo in a heartbeat. Kevin, I think you would go to Yaddo in a heartbeat. It's not totally besmirching these things entirely, but also being realistic about it. You're partying. if you're there. Most of these people are, right?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, I mean, yeah, there'll be some people who are kind of wallflowers,
Yeah.
but I mean,
Yeah.
there's a lot of extroverted artists.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
these things are strange. I sort of stop. I mean, it's interesting because it's a bit of a young person's game
Right.
too, these things.
That's we're kind of too old to go to something like Yaddo.
A little, I mean,
not
well,
technically, but like socially, if we got there, it would be a little bit like, oh,
yeah, you might be surprised, but yeah, I for sure. And then you have families, you have kids, and
right.
yeah.
So he's there with Jay McInerney, who wrote Bright Lights, Big City, and this is like Bright Lights, Big City was a big deal. Like Jay McInerney's like pulls up on a Porsche, and he's like a famous writer, and Wallace becomes friends with him. Wallace has loud sex that everybody hears with the fiction editor for Playboy, Alice Turner. Who
tremendous. Tremendous.
Yeah.
At an event like this, someone who will go, okay, it was me. Yeah. There was a roommate. There's like a house. They put us up in a house somewhere, and the following morning, maybe we had played charades too loudly. That's what I'll say on the podcast. But the following morning, this older fellow, on the way to the bathroom, he looked at me and said, "Jesus, Kevin, leave some for the rest of us." God. 100%. Can you imagine? He's having like loud sex that everybody can hear with the Playboy editor.
Yeah,
that's a boss move.
Yeah, I mean,
you got to admire that.
If he hadn't done it, would we even be talking about this time at Yaddo? Maybe not.
Sure. She's just Yaddo. Awesome.
Also, at this time, an article comes out a feature article comes out. Oh, I don't have the name of the magazine. It was a fairly major magazine. It might have been Salon or GQ or Esquire. I'm not GQ or Esquire, but a literary who's who map came out in a mainstream magazine, and David Foster Wallace was on it, but he was out at the edge. He was, quote, on the horizon, right? But still, he's a young man. It's 1987. He's 25. So to be in a mainstream article, somebody saying you're on the map, that's a pretty big deal.
And was that story published in Playboy before or after?
Oh, before it had been published by this time.
Was she the editor?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Oh, that's hilarious.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, I'm not going to get too far into this.
Nothing changes.
Yeah, I'm not going to get too far into this because they maintain a professional relationship. But there is this funny thing because he gets really obsessed with like, and this makes sense with his sort of addictions and his evolving notions of what pleasure and enjoyment mean in American life. He does a lot of research on pornography and like goes to a porn conference, and he's going to write a nonfiction piece on this. And he delivers it to Alice Turner, the editor at Playboy. And she basically writes a letter back and says, "David, I know you're really smart, and I know you think you're really smart, but you are presenting all this stuff to us like you're discovering it. We're Playboy. Like none of this is news to any of us here. Right. Like our intern could have read this."
Sure. He's being anthropological about pornography.
Right. He's like, "Oh my God, you mean people are having sex?" And are like, "Yes, we get it." Yeah.
Sure.
I just thought that was really funny. This is like, you don't.
Yeah.
You're
explaining cosplay to Comic-Con people.
Right, exactly. Now, what else is going on? I mean, he becomes his obsessiveness. You can imagine too. So the book had come out. His MFA is over. He doesn't really have a big writing project, but he's in this magazine. He's at Yada with Jay McInerney, who 1987, Jay McInerney was the big deal that year. Bright Lights, Big City was a big deal. And it was a sexy book too. I mean, it's about cocaine and partying, and he drove a Porsche. It was like cool. It was not only famous, but he was cool at the same time. So Wallace is competitive. I mean, you see what you can do, and it's like, I'm at Yaddo, he's at Yaddo, I'm in this article, he's in this article, I'm Stuppen the editor for Playboy. Like, I'm right next to this thing, right? I'm almost Jay McInerney, right? So there's just kind of an interesting thing happening there with his sort of teeping into fame, which he's not quite there yet. What else? Oh, here's the other thing. Drinking. He's drinking quite a lot. And remember what we said about this MAO inhibitor he's on. one of the side effects is liver damage if you take it with excess alcohol consumption, right? So he's not only, I mean, a lot of 25-year-olds, a lot of people drink a lot when they're 25, and you end up health-wise more or less okay. But he's got this other thing. He's taken this MAO inhibitor, which is strictly very, very deliberately counter-recommended, right? This is something you're absolutely not supposed to do. And he's basically taking none of that into account. Okay. After his MFA, he gets a temporary position, or after Yaddo, he gets a temporary position at Amherst, teaching at Amherst, basically taking over 2 classes for somebody who's taking the semester off. It's not a long-term thing. You're going to teach these classes and then you're gone. But interestingly, he's back there just 2 years after graduating himself. And this causes him to kind of spiral out. There's this sense that he hasn't made any progress, right? You're just back in the same place you were.
Yeah, but can you imagine any institution that you've been through wanting to have you back ever, Brad?
No.
This is the thing. I guess it happens for some people.
Yeah.
It's never happened for me.
Right. No, me neither.
There's no go, but we live in this weird time now where, like, you know, and maybe it's because it's this leafy, tiny liberal arts school, and he's had a successful novel, and
well, and he did really well. I mean, he had this double thesis,
won all these awards and everything.
Came out of it, published a novel. He published his undergraduate thesis.
I gotta remember too. This is a school where they know your name.
Right.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
There's 1,000 people in his graduating class or whatever. Maybe not even that.
He maybe even reads the alumni magazine.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah.
What's that?
His alumni magazine doesn't have Dairy Queen coupons in the back. Go Gophers.
Oh boy. Okay. So he's at Amherst. He's living there again. He's got some friends around, but remember this thing we said about after the westward course of the empire takes its way, he doesn't have a project, right? He doesn't have a creative direction. And he's teaching, which he hasn't adjusted. He's not able to balance his creative life out with his teaching life yet. So he just basically now starts teaching, drinking, smoking pot, who he's having it mailed to him from Tucson, which I just think is a funny detail. And he's watching a ton of TV. He's watching everything. He's watching soap operas, sitcoms, sporting events, anything, right? Like a drug, just like, give me one more as the world turns, you know? I'm going to read a little bit from the biography about how his students see him, right? Because now he's like an entity to his students. And, you know, the relationship between teachers and students is always, a lot of students always want to know a little bit more about your life. You know, they're always kind of trying to peek behind the curtain a little bit. Okay. So here's a bit about that. Okay. This is actually a little bit about that, what I just said, but also a little bit about him learning to become a teacher. So I think this is a nice little bit. Quote, Wallace knew that if he taught hard, he wouldn't be able to write, but he also knew that if he wasn't writing anyway, so he went at teaching with a fervor, covering the students' papers with pages of annotation, throwing himself into their work. Teaching brought focus and a sense of accomplishment and the knowledge that he was honoring his parents, and Wallace needed all of that. The students were astonished at his intensity. Feeling he had endured the scorn of the Arizona professors, Wallace made sure his comments were supportive and the tone of the class positive. He did not want to replicate the discouraging classroom atmosphere he had just left. He cautioned the students, as one remembers, not to, quote, tap dance in cleats on one another's stories. His syllabus was conventional, meant to teach the basic tools of writing, character, dialogue, plot. He gave his students Eudora Welty's Why I Live at the P.O. to illustrate the unreliable narrator, and Lee K. Abbott's Living Alone Nyota to showcase voice. Just because it really happened doesn't make it good fiction, he would remind them. He had the ability to shift gears in this way, to go from the pyrotechnics of writing the westward story to teaching the rudiments of fiction. In fact, the simpler the teaching, the happier it made him. He did not go to class for challenges, personal or intellectual. He went to find certainties of the sort that eluded him in his own writing. Every morning started with a grammar lesson. The difference between and among, for instance, or further and farther. I'm a grammar Nazi, he liked to tell his students. One day he put the words pulchritudinous, minuscule, big, and misspelled on the blackboard. He asked students what the 4 words had in common, and when no one knew, happily pointed out that the appearance of each was the opposite of its meaning. Pulchritudinous was ugly, minuscule was big, big was small, and misspelled was spelled correctly. The students had rarely seen him so happy. To their eyes, the 25-year-old Wallace was a mystery. He came to class in his Arizona bandana, Timberland boots, and plaid shirts, cursed, and took frequent smoke breaks. He was trying to quit smoking, so he began chewing tobacco. He was sappy to extend office hours for as long as students wanted, but if he bumped into them on the street, he hardly acknowledged them. One student was reminded of Dostoevsky's Underground Man. Mark Costello, his friend from Amherst, came for a visit and found his old roommate strangely diminished. He remembers everything happening in very slow motion, getting dressed to go out, finding car keys, finding dip, notebook, working pen, writing a phone message. The only thing in the fridge was mustard and blondies. Blondies, I'm assuming you know, are the more bland version of brownies.
Yeah.
Wallace told his college roommate he worried that pot smoking had ruined his brain permanently and he would never be able to write again. Depressed, he was still not without romantic appeal. Two undergraduate women in his class set off one day to see where he lived and were excited to find his apartment above a sandwich shop in a rundown part of Amherst. When two students in this class asked if he wanted to go hear an Irish band play in Springfield, Massachusetts, 40 minutes south on the interstate, he surprised them by agreeing. On the way home, the car, which Wallace was driving, spun out, leaving them all scared by the side of the road before they climbed back in and returned to the college. They did not repeat the adventure. To them, he looked spooked, hollowed out, adult. All right, so very weird existence there that semester at Amherst. 1988, that semester ends. He's 26 years old. He moves back to Urbana, Illinois. He's living with his parents. He decides that he needs to start going to weekly sobriety meetings. Now, he's not entirely, it's not like, okay, this is it. He doesn't ever drink again. But this is where he starts realizing not only, okay, there's the depression thing, but there's also like, I'm an addict thing, and he needs to start doing something about it. He starts making those moves. Eventually, recovery in AA would be a huge part of his life.
There's a difference between I don't drink and I can't drink.
Right.
Some people can't drink.
Yeah.
And often it's because you drink too well.
Right.
Take a lot of practice. And then that little gets its hooks in you.
Yeah. Now,
what was he drinking? What was he drinking?
You know, I couldn't find anything where he said like his preferred thing. There's stories about beer, and there's stories about a variety of liquor. I think one time on rum, but I couldn't get like what his drink. He must have had his preferred thing, but I couldn't find it.
In any case,
yeah. He starts to write a piece when he's living in Urbana back in 1988. He starts to write this piece called. For a magazine called Review of Contemporary Fiction. He starts writing this thing called Fictional Futures and the Conspicuously Young, where he is supposed to be the young voice. His essay is supposed to be the young voice amongst these other writers like John Barth and Gilbert Sorrentin, where they're just talking about like what's sort of the future of letters, right? I'm going to read you a bit from his essay because I think it's interesting. Thinking about where he's at in his life, what he's done so far with literature, where he's going. Our generation, Wallace began, is lucky enough to have been born into an artistic climate as stormy and exciting as anything since Ezra Pound and Company turned the world before last on its head. The American generation born after, say, 1955 is the first for whom television is something to be lived with, not just looked at. Our parents regard the set rather as the flapper did the automobile, a curiosity turned treat turned seduction. For us, their children, TV is as much a part of reality as Toyotas and gridlock. We quite literally cannot imagine life without it. There was, and this is not him speaking, this is the DT Max. There was more than a bit of self-reference in this point. If anyone couldn't imagine life without TV, it was Wallace. So
that's the internet now for us.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I think this is key for him to say it. This is the generation, late boomers into Gen X. This is where television became It's not just a neat thing on TV. It's not like, oh, well, we could watch the game. Oh, the presidential debates will be on that television. It's a black hole in your living room that will suck you into it.
Right.